They told me the company was just a job. They told me loyalty was sentimental. But I grew up inside these walls. I learned to breathe between quarterly reports and boardroom silences. So when the email came at 2:07 a.m., terse, clinical, 4 lines, it felt like someone had cut the oxygen out of the room. You're terminated effective immediately. The screen blurred. I read it 3 times, as if repetition could rewrite the facts. I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, the city's lights leaking in through the blinds, and I realized I had no idea who I was without that badge clipped to my sweater, without those late-night strategy decks and the whispered, "Good work, Mara," from the assistants who ran messages through the doors for the men who mattered. I slept in fits that night. When the house finally went still, I opened the small wooden box my mother had given me 2 weeks before she died, the box I hadn't wanted to look at until I had the courage. Inside was a silver key, wrapped in tissue, and a letter in her hand. Her handwriting always trembled, even when she was furious. I had read the letter half a dozen times before I understood the sentence that stopped my heart. "My blood is in that place, Mara. They took it piece by piece. I kept one key. If I'm gone, you will know what to do." I kept the key, the letter, and a silence that felt like a contract. 15 years of small defeats, being passed over, dismissed in meetings, given projects that went nowhere, all stacked like plates. I had convinced myself the fault was mine, not loud enough, not polished enough, not ruthless enough. But the letter whispered a different account. It suggested that there were things beneath the surface choices made. Names changed, ownership hidden by suits and shell companies. They had buried my mother's role in darkness. They'd buried me too. I didn't explode. I didn't shout at Patrick Lewis on the company parking lot or smash the CEO's framed diplomas. I let the rage fold itself into patience. There's a kind of power in quiet that surprises people who expect fireworks. For a week, I pretended to be broken. I let my phone buzz and ignored it. I watched colleagues send pitying texts. "So sorry, Mara," some wrote. "If you need anything." I kept the key in my pocket, and I watched them rebuild their version of normal without me. Then I started looking. There are things you can only learn when you aren't on the company roster anymore. Old memos no one thought to redact, archived emails that reveal who asked for whose signature, public filings with tiny footnotes, and one overlooked trust document in a county record that bore my family's name. My mother had been the company's founder in every sense that mattered. She'd built systems, courted the first clients, cleaned up early disasters with nothing more than a phone and stubbornness. But she'd made one mistake. She trusted a man who promised to protect her work. In their finishing handshake, he'd refiled control papers under new entities. He'd left her with honor and no paper trail that anyone else would follow. The silver key didn't open a door you could see. It opened a safe deposit box inside a bank in another city, a place Patrick never checked, a place the board assumed was a relic. Inside that box were 2 things: a set of old contracts with my mother's name and the original paper stock certificates, ink-smudged and legal, that proved ownership. There was a letter from my mother with instructions, and a USB drive labeled, "For Mara, read only if they walk away." I drove through rain to the bank. My hands were steady. There is a particular clarity in cold, sleepless lines of nocturnal driving that makes decisions feel inevitable. I opened the box, and the past turned on like a light. The contracts were precise. They named the company, they named the assets, and they named an unbreakable clause, a reversion clause my mother had quietly insisted on when the original investors had balked. If the majority stakeholder ever sold or abandoned the company, equity would revert to the founder's heirs. The ink on the certificates bore the seal of the corporation. If presented correctly, they were enough to force a re-examination of ownership. I could have screamed then, triumphant. But the kind of leverage that brings real change is built on calm, on legal patience, and on the element most executives forget: embarrassment. I called a lawyer, not the flashy one Patrick used, but a quiet, methodical woman named Farah who had a habit of reading the small print until it made people uncomfortable. We formed a plan that would not ruin the company overnight, because revenge for its own sake eats your soul. We would reclaim what was legally ours, and then decide how the company would be run next. The next morning, I walked back into the building not as Mara, the dismissed manager, but as Mara Ellis, heir and rightful claimant. The security guard paused. "We aren't supposed to let former staff in without an appointment," he said. "I have an appointment with the board at 10, I replied, and I slid the bank receipt and my mother's contracts across the desk. Whatever he expected, a wild-eyed activist, a former employee begging for restitution, was replaced by the plain, legal truth in my hands. Word moves fast in glass buildings. By 9:30, there were eyes on me in the lobby. By 10 a.m., Patrick had been interrupted mid-sip of coffee by the soft ring of his phone. A notice had been filed that would force the board to convene. An outside auditor was summoned. They asked for mediation. They called for hush meetings. That afternoon, in the same boardroom where I had once been told my contributions were nice, I presented paper, original certificates, the reversion clause, and a simple request. Return the company to legitimate ownership while we negotiate a future, or we take this through disclosure that would implicate decades of shady transfers to shell entities and the kind of tax filings that make headlines. I don't think Patrick understood the look on my face. It was not cruelty. It was a confirmation he had been wrong and that the quiet woman he had dismissed now held the power to make everyone accountable. He offered apologies, at first brittle and then oily. He offered a consulting role. He offered to resign and walk away with dignity. He offered everything but one thing, an honest hand to rebuild. We chose a path that would not eat us. We didn't humiliate people on television. Instead, we forced transparency, audited books, open authorizations, and a board reconstituted with people who had never been allowed a voice. We negotiated severance fairly. We protected the employees who had been loyal. The company kept working. The difference was that it now had to be honest. In the months that followed, I sat at the head of meetings where I had once only cleared plates. I rewired hiring systems, restructured promotions to be blind to names and loudness, and created policies that made it harder for power to hide behind charm. We brought back the engineers my boss had sidelined, and we promoted people who were no longer invisible. When people asked how I did it, I always said the same thing. I stopped letting other people define what I deserved. But that's only half the truth. The other half is that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage unlocks a small box at 2 in the morning, reads a mother's instructions, and uses the law to demand the truth. There is satisfaction in quiet justice. It doesn't make the grief disappear. I still miss my mother every day, but it does make the world a little more honest. When I walk through the office now, I see faces that were hidden before. I read their inboxes not to punish, but to ensure nothing like what happened to me can happen again. If there is a moral, it isn't revenge, exactly. It's this: keep everything that proves you are not out of spite, but out of survival. Learn the documents, know your rights, and listen to the small voice that tells you to hold on to the keys. Because sometimes the key isn't just metal. It's the permission to become the person you were always meant to be.